rolling in. Oh boy. 85 first level. Alright, Graham. Yep, there it is. About maybe. Yeah, maybe. Okay, I'm taking the left side of the boat. Outbound for the launch light. Campbell, 4-2 has a launch light. Roger, we have a landed northwest. 5, 270, okay. Now let's go to launch. 500. Okay, now let's head down off to the left. Houston up. Okay. And the circle right behind it. Okay, let's get that right now. We smell a tree.
On March 10, 1967, a calculated strike was launched against the Thai Wind Steelworks north of Hanoi, a cornerstone of North Vietnam's industrial base. The target sat deep in hostile airspace, protected by the densest network of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery on the planet. To shield the main strike force, specialised crews known as Wild Weasels would go in first to draw enemy fire, find the radars and destroy them. This is the Medal of Honor story of Major Merlin Dethlefsen and the men who hunted the hunters. Operation Rolling Thunder, the code name for America's ferocious bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began in March 1965. Its purpose was simple on paper: apply steady military pressure, destroy supply lines to the Viet Cong, which were raging in the south, and force Hanoi to negotiate. In practice, it became a war of attrition, waged from the air, a campaign shaped as much by politics as by strategy. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara controlled it from Washington with unprecedented oversight. Every major target north of the 20th parallel required approval from the White House Situation Room so as to avoid provoking Soviet or Chinese intervention. The pilots called it the long arm of Washington. They flew into the most defended airspace on Earth under rules designed not to win, but to manage the war. No strikes within the heart of Hanoi 1 week, permission the next. Then a sudden halt to avoid offending Moscow or Beijing. It was a war by the calendar. But by 1967, the restraint had faded. 2 years of losses and no progress. The enemy was still unbroken. Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp and General William Momya in the Pacific argued that unless the United States decisively hit the key industrial centres north of Hanoi, Rolling Thunder would never achieve its political aim. 50 miles north of Hanoi, the Thai Wind Iron and Steel Works was the pride of the regime. A symbol of industrial independence, built with Chinese aid in the late 1950s. By the mid-1960s, it produced almost half of North Vietnam's steel, feeding the railways, bridges and munitions plants that kept the war running. Destroying it promised a crippling blow to Hanoi's self-reliance. Thus protecting it became a matter of national survival. Over the next 4 years, Rolling Thunder would drop more than 800,000 tonnes of ordnance on the north. Power plants, oil depots, rail lines and bridges all shattered. Tens of thousands of civilians dead or displaced, their homes, often nearby what was targeted, flattened by collateral damage. Yet Hanoi's resolve only hardened. North Vietnam's leadership dispersed assets, repaired damage rapidly and received massive military aid from the Soviet Union and China, offsetting the campaign's effects. Each bomb became a propaganda victory, proof, they said, of American brutality. When Tai Nguyen was finally cleared for attack in early March 1967, the defences waiting there were nothing the US Air Force had yet faced. When Rolling Thunder began in 1965, US aircrews found themselves flying into an increasingly dense net of anti-aircraft artillery, radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, and defending MiG fighters. With heavy Soviet and Chinese support, North Vietnam built one of the most formidable integrated air defence systems in the world. In July that year, the North Vietnamese introduced the SA-2 guideline into combat, a move that fundamentally changed the threat environment. Designed by Pyotr Grushin in the early 1950s to kill high-altitude nuclear bombers, the SA-2 was never meant for low-level fighters. Vietnam forced it into that role. A standard SA-2 sight, the battery, centred on a Fan Song fire control radar with 6 single-rail launchers in a hexagon around it. Each launcher held 1 missile, with reloads waiting on trailers. In theory, these sights were fixed and standardised. In practice, the North Vietnamese adopted them to the terrain, hiding launchers in tree lines, limestone outcrops and flooded paddies, and shifted equipment between revetments to confuse reconnaissance. Here is the V-750 missile. It is a 2-staged weapon with a solid propellant motor for the initial boost phase and a hypergolic second stage sustainer. This combination accelerated the 2.6-tonne, 10.6 metre long weapon to 3.5 times the speed of sound and to the edge of the stratosphere. At the head, a 195 kilogram proximity fused fragmentation warhead. Anything caught in its blast radius ceased to exist. To locate, track, then guide the missile, the battery relied on 2 primary radar systems: the P-12 spoon rest early warning and Fan Song fire control radar. The P-12 would first detect targets out to a range of about 275 kilometres, providing bearing and distance to the command van. When a contact closed inside 120 kilometres, Fan Song took over. The mast had 3 primary antennas, each for a distinct purpose. Here, a horizontal array for azimuth, a vertical array for elevation, and a parabolic dish for precise range and missile guidance. Together they painted the target in 3-dimensional space and transmitted steering commands by radio beam to the missile's onboard computer. Early Fan Song sets needed on the order of 75 seconds from first lock to missile launch. For US crews, that moment was unmistakable. The radar warning system's rapid rattlesnake buzz in the headset when a Fan Song came out of search and into track. That was the Weasel's window, barely a minute and a quarter to find the site and kill it before the missile left the rail. As the bombing intensified, so did the guns. Between 1965 and 1968, the North Vietnamese deployed more than 8,000 anti-aircraft guns in various calibers, mostly protecting key areas around Hanoi, Haiphong, and major transport routes. Missiles dominated the headlines, but flak remained the true killer. The SA-2's weakness lay below 3,000 feet. It couldn't acquire and track or fuse properly at low altitude. Aircraft could exploit this flaw by flying low, under the radar so to speak. The NVA blanketed this gap with a AAA kill zone the US aircrews described as so thick you could almost walk on it. Dug into camouflaged and revetted positions amongst fields and the jungle clearings were most typically the following. The KS-19 was the heavy hitter. A Soviet 100mm gun firing a shell every 4 seconds to altitudes above 39,000 feet, higher than most airliners cruise today. Batteries of 6 to 8 guns controlled by radar could put accurate fire into the flight path of non-manoeuvring jets at long range. The S-60 57mm, also built as the Chinese Type 59, formed the medium caliber backbone. Each gun could fire around 70 rounds a minute and was effective up to about 20,000 feet, either with optical sights or under radar control. Batteries were spread out to cover wide corridors. At the low end sat lighter weapons such as the ZU-23, a twin-barreled 23mm mount capable of roughly 2,000 rounds per minute against aircraft screaming through the valley floor at treetop height. To improve accurate fire, the Son-9 Firecan was the primary gun-laying radar for the North Vietnamese AAA batteries. It tracked out to about 60 kilometres, computing target range, elevation and azimuth through a mechanical predictor, then sent electrical aiming commands directly to each gun's servos. With a well-trained crew, a 6-gun KS-19 battery could engage a jet at 39,000 feet with over 60% probability of a kill. Key strategic sites like the Thai Wind Steel Mill were shielded by a multi-layered air defence network, blending radar-guided heavy guns and surface-to-air missiles, lighter caliber weapons and machine guns. This integrated defence forced attacking aircraft to fly low through dense flak to avoid being within the SA-2's missile kill envelope. The deadly synergy of missiles and guns meant that there was no altitude at which a pilot was safe. High meant SAMs, low meant flak. Everything in between belonged to both. And the defences moved. Every gun, radar and launcher sat on wheels. A SAM site photographed one day could be gone the next, its gear dragged to a new location by night. Crews rarely knew exactly where the next launch or burst would come from. Finally, the system had an airborne layer. With Soviet and Chinese aid, the North Vietnamese Air Force fielded the MiG-17 and MiG-21s from bases around Hanoi and the Red River Delta, completing the Ring of Steel. This was the kill box, a sky laced with radar beams, missiles and flak. For US aircrews going downtown, every mission meant flying straight into it. By late 1965, the US Air Force realised that special measures were needed to counter North Vietnam's growing network of SAMs and radar-guided AAA. The result was the Wild Weasel program, a pioneering effort in suppression of enemy air defences, or SEAD. Wild Weasel aircraft and crews were tasked with detecting and attacking enemy air defence radars, essentially acting as hunter-killers to knock out SAM sites before they could launch, or at least to distract and suppress them so that strike planes could do their job. The unofficial Wild Weasel motto, YGBSM, or You Gotta Be Shitting Me, captured the mix of gallows humour and audacity required for this high-risk mission. And a more formal motto, First In, Last Out, described their tactical role of leading the way into targets and being the last to leave after the strike, deliberately drawing enemy fire onto themselves if necessary. To sniff out the radars, the Weasels utilised their radar warning receivers fitted to the aircraft. To put it simply, this equipment displayed vector lines or strobes in the direction of the radar emission. Coupled with aural tones in the pilot's headset, the Weasel crew could home in on the offensive. Tactically, the results came fast. Evaluators credited Weasel and Iron Hand flights with reducing SA-2 launches by as much as 90% whenever they were on station. For the first time since Rolling Thunder began, US pilots felt that they could strike heavily defended targets and have a fighting chance of coming home. When America entered the air war over North Vietnam in 1964, It brought with it the hardware of the atomic age. The Republic F-105 Thunderchief, nicknamed the Thud, was the largest single-seat, single-engined combat aircraft ever built. Designed in the early 1950s as a supersonic nuclear strike platform, the Thud was meant to rip in low and fast, toss a Mark 28 tactical nuclear weapon from its internal bay, and escape at Mach 2. It was a creature of the Cold War, sleek, heavy, and engineered for speed above all else. But when that same aircraft found itself fighting a very different war over the jungles of Southeast Asia, its mission would change forever. The F-105 was immediately useful in Vietnam because of its significant capability. No other available US fighter prior to the F-4 Phantom could carry such a heavy payload at such speed. Combined with 5 external hardpoints, the Thud could haul more than 14,000 pounds of ordnance, roughly 3 times the load of a World War II era B-17, and double the F-100 Super Sabre, and still outrun anything the North Vietnamese could field. Flying from bases in Thailand, the aircraft's combination of range, speed, and striking power made it the workhorse of Operation Rolling Thunder. By 1965, however, the airspace over North Vietnam had become the most heavily defended in history. The Soviets supplied SA-2 Guideline SAM. Radar-controlled guns and dense AAA belts were inflicting catastrophic losses. The F-100F Wild Weasel 1, which was being utilised for SAM hunting, had a big flaw. It was sluggish and vulnerable in high-threat environments, making it an easy target, and it couldn't keep up with the new F-105 strike packages. The answer was natural and simple: convert the 2-seater Thud trainer into a SAM killing machine, the F-105F. At 20.2 metres long, 10.6 metres of wingspan and towering 6 metres tall, the Thunderchief was a beast. The F-105F's sleek lines were nearly identical to the single-seat D models, but elongated 71 centimetres to fit a second seat. The fuselage was long and narrow, with unusual shoulder-mounted intakes feeding a massive Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet that produced 26,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner. Pilots trusted the engine implicitly. If the J75 quit, they were finished. Yet its power made the Thud one of the fastest aircraft of the war, capable of Mach 2 at altitude and cruising above 700 miles per hour. Swept back 45 degrees and mid-mounted, the wings were thin and heavily loaded. Perfect for speed, but provided poor handling characteristics. Pilots described it as a flying brick, and this left it vulnerable to agile and much lighter North Vietnamese MiGs, one of its key weaknesses. Instead of large ailerons, the Thunderchief relied primarily on upper surface spoilers for roll control. These panels here popped up to destroy lift on one wing and induce a roll. At low speeds, you still have small outboard ailerons, but at combat speed, the spoilers gave precise, stable handling. Leading edge slats would extend during takeoff and landing and combat manoeuvring to improve lift. Trailing Fowler flaps are provided as shown here. A unique speed brake system was formed from 4 pedals surrounding the engine exhaust, and could extend like so. The new F-105F carried a crew of 2. Up front, the pilot flew the jet and managed navigation and weapon systems. In the rear cockpit sat the electronic warfare officer known as the Bear. His job was to detect, identify and locate enemy radar emissions through the radar homing and warning sensors. To get all the way from Thailand to northern Vietnam and back, the jets needed more fuel. The F-105 was also unusual in this respect, as it could take on fuel from tankers of both a boom or drogue type configuration, improving mission flexibility, a remnant of its original nuclear strike role. The receptacle and probe are shown here, concealed beneath a slipway door and fairing panels. Mounted in the forward compartment was the M61 Vulcan rotary cannon. It fired these 20mm rounds at 6,000 per minute, effective against hard and soft targets. 1,028 rounds of ammunition are stored and fed from a drum in the nose. The primary weapon for Weasel missions was the new AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile. The Shrike was revolutionary for its time, based on the air-to-air AIM-7 Sparrow, fitted with a special seeker. When a fan song focused its radar beam and locked up the jet, the Shrike would ride that signal all the way back to its source. As the fan song took roughly 75 seconds to lock and launch, the Weasel had a narrow window to identify, get inside the effective range and fire off a Shrike. As an early generation ARM, the Shrike had 3 key disadvantages. A range of only 8 miles against the 18 of the SA-2 meant that crews were significantly exposed. The seeker head was pre-programmed on the ground for a specific mission. You could target fan songs or gun-laying fire can radar, but not both. Finally, the seeker would lose tracking if the source simply switched off their radar, as there was no onboard target memory. To follow up, it was the CBU-24 cluster bomb that gave the F-105 its most devastating and controversial weapon. Each canister carried over 600 tennis ball-sized submunitions, designed to shred soft targets and radar vents scattered across a site the size of a football field. Against dispersed SAM crews or AAA batteries, it was brutally effective. Against anything unfortunate enough to be nearby, it was indiscriminate. Thousands failed to detonate, leaving lethal duds across Vietnam and Laos that still kill civilians today. Despite its power, the Thunderchief had flaws. It was heavy, with limited manoeuvrability at low altitude, and its single engine left no margin for error. Ground crews struggled with maintenance. The hydraulic systems that drove its spoilers and flaps were prone to failure in Southeast Asia's heat and dust. Loss rates were high. By war's end, nearly half of all F-105s built had been lost, most to ground fire. Yet the aircraft's record was staggering. Over 20,000 combat sorties flown, and more bombs dropped on North Vietnam than by any other type. For the men who flew it, the Thunderchief was a paradox. Heavy and unforgiving, yet fast, stable and utterly dependable when it mattered. Alright, listen up. Weather's breaking and we've got a narrow window. At 1100 hours, the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing will launch a coordinated strike on the Tai Nguyen Iron and Steel Works, one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in North Vietnam. Your objective is simple: cripple the plant's production capability and disrupt the flow of war material heading south. Support and composition. 4 EB-66s from the 41st, call sign Doghouse, will be on station early in bracketing orbits north and south of the target area. They'll provide area jamming on known fan song, spoon rest and fire can frequencies. Do not expect them to blind anything, they'll only thin the picture. Today's operation is a 3-base effort. Karat's 388th Tactical Fighter Wing will hit the plant first. Takhli F-105Ds of the 354th follow on the second wave, call sign forward. Out front, Lincoln Flight, F-105F Wild Weasels will spearhead the second package in the Iron Hand role, hunting and suppressing SA-2 fan song radars so the rest can reach the target. F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon provide MiG cap and top cover during ingress and egress. KC-135s will be on the green track over Thailand and Laos for refueling in and out. Combat Search and Rescue. Udon and Da Nang are on alert, but recovery north of the border is highly unlikely once the strike begins. If you get down en route Pack 6, odds are you'll spend the rest of the war in the Hanoi Hilton, so plan to come home in your seat. Route and timing. Flights depart Takhli by element on schedule, climb to altitude and rendezvous with the tankers on the northern track. Cross the fence at the push time with the roar up and music on. Stay tight on the northern track to skirt the densest missile belts around downtown. Initial point is north of Thud Ridge. The Weasels will move out 5 minutes ahead of the strike to provoke radar activity and engage emitters with AGM-45 strikes. Strike flights will continue per timing. There will be no formal go call from the Weasels. If the boys neutralise the site en route, that's your breathing space. If not, you fly the envelope on profile. Over the target, maintain spacing. Wings level, on-time releases. Once ordnance is gone, brake hard on the egress heading, stay low and clear the threat ring. Rendezvous with tankers as briefed or proceed direct home if fuel allows. Threat picture. Thai Win is ringed by multiple SA-2 guideline batteries and layered 37, 57, 85 and 100mm AAA, radar directed by fire cans. Expect intense flak starting 10 miles out and peaking to saturation over the complex. As we are the second element, the defences will be on alert. Fanson operators have been unpredictable. They may hold low power until you're committed, then spike you as you roll in. VPAF MiG-17s and 21s operate from Phuc Yen and Kep. Intercepts possible during or after egress. The Phantoms have the cap, but keep your eyes out and radios disciplined. Rules of engagement and aborts. No single ship dives into an active SAM envelope. If the Weasels can't silence the site, use terrain and timing. Do not loiter. Badly damaged or fuel critical aircraft divert south. Divert for today's mission will be Udon. If you're forced down today, beacon up only when clear of enemy troops and maintain radio silence unless in contact with rescue. This will be one of the toughest runs we've flown. Timing, precision and discipline decide who comes home. Fly the profile, hit the target and get out together. That's the brief.
148. Don't kick my first out.
Okay, I won't take your first.
Major Merlin Dethlefsen climbs the ladder of his F-105F, call sign Lincoln 3. Originally from the farmlands of Iowa, he's quiet and focused. Years of flying have taught him that panic solves nothing. Behind him, Kevin Mike Gilroy checks the rear cockpit. A Californian with quick reflexes and sharper instincts, Gilroy has become one of the best electronic warfare officers in the theatre.
Takhli ground. Lincoln Flight of 4, request engine start.
Lincoln Flight, start approved. Ramp is clear.
Lincoln 3, ground power connected. External air ready. How do you hear me?
I got you, loud and clear on interphone. We're ready to start.
Copy. Power stable, no flags. You're clear to crank when ready.
Roger, battery off. Check. External DC voltage looks good. Mike, ready for engine start?
I'm ready.
Chief, go ahead and fire up the hover.
Roger. Stand by. Air coming on. Pressure steady.
RPM rising at 12%. Throttle idle. Cranking.
Light off good. EGT nominal. Oil pressure positive.
Oil lights out. Check. Positive fuel flow. RPM 30%. Chief, we're good up here. Disconnect air.
Affirmative. Air off.
Engine stable. Switching battery on. Chief, disconnect ground power.
Copy. You're good to go.
AC gen cycle on. Mike, APR 25 coming up.
Copy. Raw powered. Audio tone in my headset. Good sweep.
I've got the front panel up. Launch light out. Check.
Rear head mirrors in. System green.
Good. Doghouse is moving.
Lincoln flight, check in.
2 up.
3's up.
4 up.
Copy, 4 up. It's showtime. Takhli, ground Lincoln 1, flight of 4 F-105s, request taxi to arming.
Lincoln 1, taxi via Alpha to arming point 1. Once ready, proceed to runway 36 and hold short. Altimeter 29er85, wind 10 at 5.
Lincoln 1 copies, Alpha to arming point 1, hold short 36.
Shots out. Good luck.
Lincoln flight, rolling.
The arming area was the point at which ordnance technicians pull the final safety pins for the weapons on each aircraft. They hold up these pins to each pilot to confirm.
Okay, Mike, let's close up.
Canopy coming down. Hooks over rollers.
Front hooked, lights out and sealed. Mike, takeoff checklist.
Takhli Tower, Lincoln 1, flight of 4, holding short 36, ready for takeoff.
Lincoln 1 flight, clear for takeoff, runway 36. Wind 010 at 5, gust 10. Clear skies on departure.
Lincoln 1, into burner, rolling.
Lincoln 2, rolling.
first milestone for the mission would see Lincoln Flight and the Ford strike aircraft rendezvous with KC-135 tankers flying over northern Thailand and Laos to top off the tanks prior to crossing the fence into Vietnam.
Young Tiger 3-5, Lincoln Flight, checking in. 4 thuds. About 10 miles south of your track at 18,000.
Lincoln 1, Young Tiger 3-5 copies. Up left-hand orbit, flight level 220-270 knots. Join heading 340 and report visual.
Roger, joining heading 340. Flight will refuel by element 1 and 2, followed by 3 and 4. Copy. Lincoln 1, ready pre-contact.
Lincoln 1, you're cleared contact. Contact. Lincoln 1, you're taking fuel.
Would you believe checking out, Bill? Yeah, I would. I will get somebody. Yeah.
Lincoln 2, cleared contact. Disconnect now.
Roger, 220, you're cleared outbound en route frequency, thank you.
Lincoln 3, moving to pre-contact.
Contact. Getting good fuel, Merlin.
Every time the guy talked on Fox Mike, he got a lot of split there. And full 12 didn't help him. They did come to it, but I don't know how that could work.
Lincoln 3, disconnected.
Lincoln Flight, we're crossing the fence. Clean them up and green them up.
Lincoln 3, copy. Master arm on. 3's clean and green.
I've got the APR 25 up. Looks like an emitter, 1 o'clock.
Yep, got activity already.
Now deep into North Vietnam, Thud Ridge loomed on the horizon. A distinct landmass which provided a navigational reference point and SAM buffer for all Thud pilots flying missions during Rolling Thunder.
Lincoln 1, Ford lead. Give me your picture up front.
Ford lead, Lincoln. We're just passing turn point 5, 25 miles from the IP. Weather's improving. Broken layer around 3,500. Gaps opening over the ridge line.
Copy. How's visibility toward the mill?
Haze is thinning. I can see the valley floor in patches. You'll have something workable by the time you're here.
Roger that. Good hunting.
Tally target area, 10 miles. Spread out and expect MiGs in the slice. SAM's after the split. Keep it tight.
The Crab Boys have stirred up the hornet's nest.
Okay, see
the smoke from the target area up there. Ain't no doubt about it.
Looks like we have a fan song in search, a couple of fire cans. Got it. Prepare to split elements for pop-up. Flak opening up. Black puffs, 12 o'clock. Here we go. Pop up now. Split, split. Rattlesnake tone coming in. He's going high, PRF. 3-ringer spike. Steady track.
Copy. Fan song tracking us. No launch light yet.
I'm closing in. Strike tone hasn't got him yet. Lincoln 1 in hot. Lead, they have you zeroed. Get out of there. Breaking. Beeper, on guard. Got shoots, 9 low. Merlin, get us clear this flak. Jesus, lead's been shot down. And we got a buggy low at 2. Well, I'm in a bad spot. Left wing. Bad vibrations in the controls. Get out of there, Bill. Jettison and divert. Roger. Jettisoning. I'll try for Udorn.
It's only been 2 minutes, and already Lincoln Flight had been cut in half. Lincoln 1 was shot down, and his wingman, Lincoln 2, badly damaged by flak. With the strike package only minutes away and the SAM threat still at large, Death Lefson had to make a decision.
What do you want to do, Merlin?
Got plenty of fuel, bombs, missiles, and gun. We still have work to do.
Ford needs us.
Lincoln 3 taking lead. Lincoln 4, form on me.
Roger, rejoining.
I've lost the SAM. He switched off.
We are outside effective strike range anyway. Turn back and heading 180.
I'm just crossing the river now, Steele.
And into bullseye, 324, 39 miles, heading east, altitude medium.
Great, we got bandits coming in. Oh, and fan song tracking gone hot. 3-ringer, bearing 125.
4, what's your status?
Flak heavy, visibility shithouse, but can see you up to your 7 o'clock.
Alright, we'll go staggered. Follow me in.
Come right, 10. Strike up. Good tone. Smoke him.
Strike away! Oh shit! A tall high. Brake up and sniffing again. He's painting us. Gonna need you to point it out. Can't see much up front. I've got him. Come heading 260. Roger. We'll hit him with a CBU pair. Turning hot. 4, where are you?
Following on your 6.
Lincoln, this is Ford. We are commencing our run-in. Lincoln 3 in hot. Pickle.
Good hits. Sights cooking. Secondaries.
Lincoln 4 in hot. Pickle. Good hits, Lincoln 4. Let's finish it off with guns. Lincoln 3 in hot. Lincoln 4 in hot. Local raw clean. No active fan song on scope. Ford just confirmed. They're off target. We're done. Egress west, low and fast. Ford flight running in.
I'm right over the target right now. I've got a 17 right in front of him.
Ford tore it up pretty good. Yeah. Wonder if today will make a difference. Probably not. Glad we got those sights. Just doing our job. Merlin, check low, 3 o'clock. 2 Phantoms, one's in trouble. That's Pardo's bunch from Bone. Hell, he's got the tail hook out. Jesus, pushing him with the hook? Yeah, he's shoving him out of North Vietnam. That's one way to earn your beer back at the club. All right, let's get home. We'll hit the tanker on the way. Been in burner too long. Yeah, we're getting down to fumes. Roger. I don't feel like walking home.
When the noise of the day finally faded, the surviving aircraft from Lincoln Flight sat cooling on the ramp at Takhli. Ground crews traced the flak holes, counted missing panels and exchanged looks that needed no explanation. The men climbed down from their cockpits stiff and exhausted. In the days that followed, the Air Force took stock of what happened over Tai Win. The raid had resulted in no loss of strike aircraft. No SAMs were launched due to the actions of the Weasels that day. Merlin Detlefsen was awarded the Medal of Honor not simply for pressing the attack, but for repeatedly choosing not to disengage when standard procedure gave him every justification to do so. With his flight dislocated, and after sustaining significant damage to heavy flak, doctrine allowed him to abort and withdraw west with no loss of mission credibility. Instead, he remained forward, deliberately continuing to provoke the SA-2 radar so that any missile launches would be drawn towards him and away from the strike aircraft behind. His electronic warfare officer, Captain Mike Gilroy, received the Air Force Cross for maintaining threat awareness and radar tracking throughout those passes, enabling that decision to be carried through. Major Ken Bell was awarded the Silver Star for pressing his own attack despite battle damage to his own aircraft. These citations weren't celebrations of victory, they were acknowledgements of what those men had faced in the valley north of Hanoi and what it had cost them to get home. For Major David Everson and Captain Jose Luna, who had been shot down, well, they were captured almost immediately by the North Vietnamese and spent the rest of the war alongside other American POWs. It wouldn't be until Operation Homecoming in 1973, 6 years later, that they would be released following the Paris Peace Accords. Captain Bill Heft in Lincoln II had managed to drag his stricken aircraft all the way back to Udon and survived the mission. For the Wild Weasel community, the mission became another example of the dangerous rhythm of their work. They didn't talk much about fear, and they didn't dwell on the odds. Losses were heavy across the program, and every squadron bar in Thailand had its empty seats. The men coped in their own ways, usually quietly, sometimes with dark humour, and always with a shared awareness that the next sortie could go either way. The Weasel job didn't make headlines, but the strike crews behind them knew exactly what it meant to have those two-seat thuds flying out in front. Across the theatre, Rolling Thunder continued to grind on. The campaign had begun with confident predictions that strategic pressure would force Hanoi to negotiate. By 1967, it had become clear that the bombing alone would not achieve that goal. Targets were selected and removed by political debate in Washington. Some industrial sites were hit once, then left untouched long enough to be repaired. Others were struck repeatedly with little lasting effect. North Vietnam dispersed factories, moved supplies by night, and relied on Soviet and Chinese support to replace damage almost as quickly as it was inflicted. Air crews saw this up close. They flew past bridges they had only destroyed months earlier, now rebuilt. They attacked storage depots that had already been emptied or relocated. It was a campaign fought at enormous cost, and often with frustration and inconsistency. Taiwan itself, though hit hard that day, would resume production not long after the attack. For many pilots, this pattern left a lingering sense that their sacrifices were being measured against shifting objectives that never quite aligned with the reality on the ground. In October 1968, Rolling Thunder finally came to an end. There was no triumph in its conclusion, only a sudden halt. The bombing stopped as a political gesture aimed at opening peace talks. For the men who had flown the missions, the end brought relief, but also reflection. Hundreds of American aircraft had been lost over the north. Hundreds of pilots and backseaters were dead or prisoners, and despite all of it, the war continued. Yet out of those years came lessons that would shape the future of air operations. Crews learned to adapt to a sophisticated layered defence system, the first of its kind they had ever faced. They learned the value of coordination between jamming aircraft, Weasel teams and strike packages. They saw the limitations of unguided bombing and the need for precision. And they understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that an air campaign fought without clear, consistent objectives would always struggle to achieve lasting results. As for the Wild Weasels, their role endured, but the legacy wasn't built on mythology. It came from practical necessity. The mission they pioneered, identifying, suppressing and destroying enemy air defences, became a standard requirement for every major air operation that followed. Later aircraft and newer missiles would refine the job, but the essential idea remained the same. You can't strike targets in defended airspace unless someone goes in first to clear the way. Merlin Dethlefsen continued his career with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown on the flight line in Thailand until retiring from the Air Force a colonel in 1977. Mike Gilroy mentored younger electronic warfare officers who would carry the mission forward in new aircraft and new conflicts. He also retired a colonel in 1987 and would later run for mayor back in California. Both men having flown over 100 combat missions during the war, neither of them saw themselves as larger than that war that they fought. They were simply men doing a difficult job in an environment where experience and teamwork mattered more than anything printed in a manual. Looking back, the Thai Wind mission stands as one chapter in a much larger story. It did not change the outcome of Rolling Thunder, nor could it. But it revealed something about the people who flew into North Vietnam day after day. Their resilience, their discipline, and their determination to bring each other home. In a conflict defined by shifting strategies and political restraint, these qualities sometimes felt like the only constants. Today, the roar of the F-105 had long faded from the flight lines of Southeast Asia. But the lessons learnt in those years about courage, limits, and the realities of modern air war remain. And somewhere in the memory of every pilot who studies Vietnam, there is an image of two aircraft pressing forward through flak and intense missile trails, committed to a task that few would ever volunteer for, and fewer still could truly understand. The Thai Wind mission did not end Rolling Thunder, but it stands as a reminder of what the airmen endured, and what they carried with them long after the bombing stopped. It is a story not only of bravery, but of consequence, the human cost behind the strategy, and the men who bore it.